So the next speaker is Fei Xu from right here at Berkeley.
Well, thanks for the invitation to speak here. The workshop has been great fun. So it's also great to follow Brendan and Mike's talks because I'm also a cognitive scientist. In particular, I study little humans, both language and cognition, but more on the cognitive development side. So it's great to follow Mike as well. All right, so for some of you, a lot of this is going to be really familiar territory. But I hope for people who are not in development and not in psychology and cognitive science, we can sort of give you a sense of what kind of work we do and how they might be relevant for thinking about AI and vice versa. All right. So a lot of us, a lot of people in this room, in fact, study conceptual development in infants and young children. And primarily, we're interested in the following kind of questions, right? One is trying to think about how to characterize the initial state of the young human learner. And there are different views on this. So core knowledge is a very prominent view that's been around for the last 40 years or so. And I will talk a lot more about that today. And the idea is that there's a set of core knowledge systems that are in place either innately or very early, definitely within the first year. And the babies think about things like objects, inanimate things versus agents, primarily human, maybe animals. And they might have a system for thinking about abstract things like numbers and probability, those kind of things, right? And that's where the foundation of later development. And in contrast, people have held the blank slate view. So you'll have a set of sensory motor primitives to begin with, and you do these massive associative learning sort of type of things, and eventually something interesting emerges, right? And just as important, many of us are interested in thinking about the kind of learning mechanisms that can get us from a very young human learner to the mature state. And here are just some examples of the kind of mechanisms that people have been thinking about for some time now. Certainly, there's a lot of work on thinking about associative learning mechanisms from early days of development. These days, people talk about probabilistic reasoning, and language is often hypothesized as a kind of mechanism, right? So the child, a pre-linguistic child, will have certain kind of tools in their toolbox, and there's observational learning, and they can, once they can act on the world, they can try out things and learn physical variables, et cetera, et cetera. But once you know language, you can imagine all of a sudden, if you understand how language works, you can get so much more information and knowledge just from language alone, right? And of course, language can give you clues as to how to carve out the world into relevant categories, kinds, event types, et cetera, right? You can imagine it's a really, really powerful tool. And there are other people who have looked at these, what I think of as constructive learning mechanisms, thinking about explanation or analogy going from one domain to another. There are a lot of really nice examples from history of science and some examples from developmental psychology. And things like thought experiment, right? Where it's a case where it's not actually about the data at all. So unlike a lot of the models we see these days, you're getting more and more data, right? But a thought experiment, again, there's some really nice examples in history of science where Galileo was not, dropping every rock from the top of the Tower of Pisa, but instead he worked out the thought experiment and figured out a very important physical law, right? And there's some examples from adult cognitive psychology showing this kind of phenomena as well. So this, type of mechanisms that people have been talking about for a long time, and again, people come in different flavors, different camps, some emphasizing some of these mechanisms than others, right? And lastly, we're interested in thinking about the more adult, more mature state. And there are some candidates on the table, so intuitive theory is one that I would argue very strongly for, that at the end of the day, we still have a set of domain-specific knowledge systems, quite different from core knowledge systems, but they might be sort of theory-like in really important ways, right? And here's just a partial list of many of the people who have contributed to thinking about those key questions in conceptual development. Now I want to turn something into something more specific, namely thinking about infant cognition. That is, how do we think about the emotional state of the young human learner? Right? And in particular, a very prominent view, largely attributed to Liz Berkeley and others, is the core knowledge view. Right? As I mentioned before, the idea is that the little human may start with a very small set of, I think by 2002, Liz said maybe there are 6 of them. But really, when we look at the stated evidence, there may be like 4 or something of that sort. That there's a system of thinking about physical objects, right? Medium-sized objects, and sometimes maybe just manipulable objects that are very common in the child's environment very early. And of course, the other type of entities they're really, really concerned about, maybe even more so, is agents, right? Humans, in fact. Some people might say that's a lot more important to think about how the social world works as opposed to the physical world, right? And I think there's some merit to that idea. They might develop a lot of knowledge about agents very quickly because it's so key to their survival, and there's tons of input from the immediate environment from day one. Actually, minus 9 months, right? There's already input of different kinds, even in the womb. And number is something very abstract that's been studied a great deal, including some of the work we've done in our lab and others. And space, so navigation. And there's an abstract sense of space that's actually more related to geometry, which poses an interesting question, which is about how to think about geometric layouts that becomes useful for things like navigation, right? And people have talked about maybe social relationships is another one. So it's kind of a little bit of an offshoot of thinking about agency, right? But now you think about how agents interact with each other, and there might be there's some newer studies suggesting maybe even 1-year-olds have some sense of how agents interact with each other, right? So those are some of the candidates that are on the table. And turn to the mature state, this idea of there's a set of intuitive theories that are coherent, that are causal and explanatory, right? And some of them correspond quite well with some of the things in the core knowledge view. So we have much more elaborate intuitive physics, and certainly much more elaborate intuitive psychology that adds things like emotions and lots of things, right? Concern about reputation and lots of things you can add to that theory. And we also may develop intuitive biology that may or may not be there at the beginning. So we can go beyond the core knowledge systems. But people debate about the status of intuitive biology, right? And for people in this room, everybody probably does have a theory of number, but for the average person on the street, I don't think we really have a theory of number per se. But our number concepts undergo a lot of development, and we'll see from the infant data. In particular, by the time we're 3 or 4 or 5, and we get to a set of number concepts that actually support things like counting and arithmetic. Right. All right. Yeah. Question.
For knowledge, to what extent is it the case that it's thought these concepts are encoded in like the gene somewhere?
Right.
They just develop very quickly somehow.
Depends on who you ask, right? So in Spelke's latest book in 2022, she takes a strong view that these are evolutionarily endowed systems of knowledge that they will already have, especially in the case of object and agent and number and maybe a few others. But many people will say, okay, these are probably early emerging, right? Because you do get tons of input that's quite consistent with the kind of things you can think about with these medium-sized objects and tons of interactions with fellow humans. Perhaps that allows you to develop that knowledge really, really quickly. But nevertheless, I would say by the end of the first year, there is a rich body of work suggesting these systems are in place, right? Whether you think it's innate or not, right? Whether you think it's part of the prior or you might need some pre-training to get to the priors. So feel free to interrupt me, by the way, because I know for some of you this is like, you already know everything I'm going to say for at least first half of the talk. But others, if it's unfamiliar territory, please ask. All right. So, in particular, many people have argued for this view that really, even from the get-go, or shortly after that, we're developing these domain-specific systems, right? So for objects, once you can identify things that are not capable of self-generated motion, those are the inanimate things in their environment, certain things will follow the set of principles allow you to reason about them, like cohesion and solidity and continuity. So there are things like, objects cannot go from point A to point B without traversing connected path in between, right? We can't teleport, essentially. And solid objects cannot pass through each other, right? And a few principles like that, they apply to physical objects, right? In contrast, agents, once you can identify them, these are often things that are capable of self-generated motion. That's a very strong cue. And then you might start thinking about things like intentions, goals, and preferences, desires, and beliefs, right? So it's a set of concepts that allows us to reason more about agents, right? And they're largely separate from each other, right? And of course, number is a very abstract case where there isn't sort of specific input you're interested in, but what you're interested in really is the cardinality of the set, or approximate cardinality of the set, and comparison between sets, and maybe you can do some rudimentary arithmetic as well. And if you think about intuitive theories, these have been argued to be really structured beliefs, in the sense that there are causal networks of beliefs, right? So some beliefs are causally deeper and more central, and others may be more peripheral, right? Take a simple example, like, you and I probably have a pretty similar concept of what a cow is, right? We may disagree as to how many cows there are in the world. I have, say, 5 million, you say 2 million. Doesn't matter that much, even we have a different belief, right? But if I believe that cows are animals, and you believe cows are controlled by aliens from Mars, that's a very different kind of belief that will play a very different kind of role, causal role in our system of thinking about of these intuitive theories. All right, so I want to give you a couple of, just one actually concrete example of thinking about objects. Also, for those of you who are not familiar with how we do studies with infants, how do we know these things? I want to give you a couple examples to show that, right? So for objects, people have done a lot of work looking at things like cohesion. So this is a case where if I have an object, if I try to pick up, touch the top part of it and try to lift it, the whole thing will come with it, right? So objects don't spontaneously fall apart, and objects don't just start to collapse into other and merge into other objects, right? Adults should believe this. There's really nice studies with adults showing those principles actually still hold in our adult perceptual system. And continuity, as I said, is the idea of objects traversing temporally connected paths, right? And solidity is when this is, two objects cannot occupy the same place at the same time. Therefore, object, if a solid, cannot pass through another solid object. On contact, again, intuitive idea that action at a distance is strange and weird. And when we see that, right, like when you, probably the first time the child takes the remote control and tries to turn on the TV, that's going to be a case of violation of contact, right? For the most part, we think, has to be, this is related to the causal event that Mike was talking about this morning, where if A hits B, you expect that B gets launched. But if A moves towards B, stops, wait, then B moves, we don't get the same causal perception, right? Michelian launching events have been studied a great deal. And again, these things in fact hold in the adult system as well. Okay. Here's just a quick way to summarize some of those principles and thinking about how they might work and what that might look like. But more importantly, I'm going to ask you to pretend you're an infant watching an event. This is actually really realistic version of what we do with infants. So this is a physical reasoning experiment, courtesy Lisa Feigenson. I heard people saying, wow, this is great magic, right? It's very simple. And kids probably don't see this kind of scenarios at their homes very often. So it's outage distribution test, I would say. So at the beginning, the experiment shows this board and knocks on it to show it's solid. right? And places it on this path and covers the front to make the magic trick a little bit easier. And then she rolls the little toy car down the ramp and then wait a couple seconds. And then you lift the occluder and magically the car had gone through the first wall and it's been stopped by the second wall. Right. We measure looking time. Right. So this is the end of this is the trial. We freeze. Nothing happens. We measure how long infants look at this display. Okay. And then this version, the beginning is exactly the same. It's a solid object. Put an occluder in front of it. Okay, now you look at this and say, okay, the world is what I think it should be, right? Here's a solid object, there's another solid object. The wall should stop the car, and this is a perfectly normal event, right? Again, this would be beginning of the test trial. We stop here, and we measure how long infants look at this display, right? And this is, there are different variants of this study and various controls, and you can ask me about those. The main finding is that as young as 4 months of age, infants will look longer at that impossible or certainly improbable event, the first one, right, where the toy car had gone through the first wall and stopped by the second wall, right? Whereas for this one, they'll look for a few seconds and they look away. Again, these studies, this set of studies has been replicated many, many times across different laboratories, different age babies. Okay. So that's kind of the general methodology that's used in many, many of those studies. It's not the only one we use for older babies. People can use, search task, and once they can, they're mobile, you can ask them to crawl to one location to the other to make a choice, et cetera, right? But for really, really young infants, this is sort of the primary method that we use. Ask infants, how are they thinking about the physical world? How are they thinking about the psychological world? What do you think about other people? How they should behave, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Other questions about the methods? All right. Okay. So that's one example of from physical reasoning. And as I mentioned, for agents, once you identify those things that are capable of self-generated emotion, infants start to think of them as things that are capable of goal-directed action. And they may have preferences, they might have likes and beliefs and intentions, and those things are important for their reasoning about agents and only agents. Right? So here is an example in really robust study, very, very simple study that Amanda Woodward did some years ago. And the method is still being used in the field, asking lots of other questions. So the very simple setup is that you show infants 6-month-olds and maybe slightly older ones as well, as she and her collaborator did later on. 2 objects, a ball and a bear. And during habituation, which is just a set of trials to repeat the same thing over and over again, right? The hand comes in from one side and reaches for the bear, right? And it stops on the bear, and then we measure how long the infant looks. At the beginning of looking for a long time is a new event, right? Keep doing this, trial 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Right? Eventually the infants get bored, right? And now she does this very simple thing, which is cover the whole thing up, and then when the display is shown again, the 2 objects have swapped positions, right? So now the bear is on the left and the ball is on the right. Okay. And on alternate trials, 1 or 2 things happens. Either you continue to reach for the bear, she called this old goal event, right? If you think the goal is to reach for a particular object, right? Contrasted with a new goal event. And the new goal event is actually a familiar one where the path of motion, if you think about the hand, is exactly the same between that and the habituation trial, right? And the idea is that what she was trying to get at is when babies look at human actions, are they just encoding the physical path, right? Because here it just goes to that location over and over again. Or do they have a different kind of interpretation, that is, the hand actually has a goal, and the goal is marked by the identity of the object, namely, she wants the bear. Okay. And here's a simple test of that, because once you switch the objects, you can tell whether they're thinking, reaching for the bear is still the same goal, and reaching for the ball is no longer the same goal. And many studies have used this method and finding converging evidence that, again, it's a looking time study, that the infants will look longer at the new goal event, even though it has the same path of motion, if you're just tracking the hand as a blob, right? And she's done many, many versions of this study where she contrasted the hand with a set of inanimate things that are kind of hand-like. So for example, she used a sponge with some cutout that looks like fingers, right? And is attached to a rod. So at the beginning, just to see the sponge touching the bear over and over again, right? Make it as similar as possible to the hand situation. And then on the test trial, to switch the two objects, again, old goal event versus new goal event, right? And what you find is that hands are special. Hands are considered agents, and hands can have goals to reach for a particular object. But these other things, like I think she tried a sponge and a claw that looks like a human hand, and there's other things, right? And infant understanding is actually even more sophisticated than that. You have a hand. Some actions are interpreted as intentional, right? There are some adult studies on this as well. We're actually very sensitive to what counts as the intentional action. So if you have the same hand with all the low-level cues, if it just kind of flops on the bear during habituation, then the interpretation goes away. That's no longer intentional action. Therefore, there isn't an end goal that the agent has in mind. Right? So it's not just about the hand versus everything else. Right? It also depends on how the actions are produced. Right? So there's a really rich literature using this very simple method trying to get at this idea that certain things are considered agents, and certain actions are considered intentional actions, and that has certain kind of interpretation that infants will provide in those kind of cases. And that's different from thinking about sponges and claws and et cetera, et cetera. Right. Okay, so that's one example from intuitive agency. So here's another example where during habituation, there is a solid barrier on the stage. This is actually on the computer. And these balls actually move around a little bit to suggest they're capable of self-generated motion. And then this one jiggles and jumps over the wall and then goes to the other side, and they both jiggle together as to say we're happily together, or something like along those lines, right? That's habituation. And then on the test trials, they simply removed the barrier, right? And either this object produces the same motion, the jumping motion to this side, or it just goes straight to the other agent. Right. Again, this looks superficially like the habituation trials because it still produces the same motion, and this one seems brand new. Right. But the idea behind the study is that if they think agents are rational, and if the physical constraint is removed, like the barrier, there's no need to jump. Right. You just go from, if you want to get to your friend, you just kind of take a straight line and get to it. Very efficient, right? So the efficiency principle is another one that's been discovered in the infant literature by about 12 months of age. Here's another example of that where there's an occluder, this thing jumps during habituation, and then when you take away the occluder, if there's a block that's actually in the path, then the jumping makes perfect sense, right? And the baby is perfectly happy with it, even though there's a brand new object there. They're like, okay, that is consistent with what I just saw. But if there's nothing there and the same motions produces still jumps, the babies are like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. They actually stare along at it, reliably so, suggesting that they find it unexpected. Okay. So there's a body of work using this method in running many, many, many studies across labs and many, many controls. You can imagine lots of alternatives that you can think of that people have tried to root out with various control experiments. And that's really the basis of this claim that there may be very domain-specific knowledge very early in infancy. Okay. Yeah. All right, I'll be quick. Some years ago now, we did some studies on number sense, which is the sense of approximate number, and largely inspired by a huge literature in animal cognition, which is many, many species, fish, and rat, pigeons, certainly primates, and you name it, right? They always have something like the number sense. And really, really well-controlled animal studies to show this. So we wanted to test this with infants. So here's one study we did some years ago where we take a bunch of 6-month-olds, and half of them habituated to a bunch of 8-dot displays. And the dots, are scattered across the page, and they have different sizes and to control for things like, the amount of brightness, the average brightness, or the amount of ink on the page, and various other things, right? And the other half, the infants, habituated to a bunch of 16-dot displays. Again, the dots vary in size and configuration, and et cetera, right? And on the test trials, these are actually identical. We showed them new displays of 16 dots versus 8 dots, and we chose other, a different size individual dot, and we changed the display size to equate for average density and things like that. And the idea is if you habituate to 888, if you really got some sense that there's really roughly the same number of dots, you should dishabituate to 16 and be bored with another 8-dot display, and reverse that preference if you're habituated to a 16-dot display, right? So that's the idea. And what we found with 6-month-olds is that indeed, that if you're habituated to 8, they dishabituate to 16, and vice versa. Okay. And we and a bunch of other people try to actually track the development of how sensitive, what's the visual acuity, if you like, of number sense, right? So Veronica Izard and others and her collaborators actually test newborns with a modified methodology to show that it has to be like a 1-to-3 ratio for infants to be sensitive to like 16 versus 18 dots. And we showed by 6 months of age, it's like 1-to-2. And we did not just 8 versus 16, but also like 16 versus 32, et cetera. But at that point, they can't tell the difference between 8 and 12 or 16 and 24, right? And then a little bit later, the acuity gets better. They can tell the difference between 8 and 12, but not a difference between an 8 and 10. And people have done lots of psychophysical studies with adults. So I think by adults, for adults, we can tell the difference between 100 dots and 115. But when it's less than that, you can't, without counting, obviously, right? Just glance at the page and do a quick estimate, and then the question is how accurate, what's the visual acuity that we can get. And in our own lab, we've gone beyond the number sense, trying to look at other aspects of quantitative development. Again, I want to show you another looking time study that we did some years ago. So this time we showed them a bunch of ping pong balls. The first one, lots of red and a few white. And the second one, lots of white and a few red. This is edited. That doesn't go quite as fast in real life. And now the experiment does some random sampling. She closes her eyes each time she reaches in. And she says, if I'm going to pull out a bunch of ping pong balls. Measure looking time. You're like, okay, that's perfectly normal, right? And everything clears. We start over. We show a closed box. Again, she does some random sampling. You're surprised, right? This is not an impossible event, it's an improbable one. Yeah.
Very interesting experiments. So in these looking time studies, how do we know that longer looking time corresponds to surprise and not some other factors like joy or pleasure or something else?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So what you find very consistently is that if you take the adult, if you take the adult interpretation, when we look at the study, we really have very strong intuitions about this one is highly improbable. Or if the car has gone through the wall, it's really very surprising, right? So that's one way to compare the infant response to the adults. But you're right, there may be other reasons. But you can have other measures, like, if you, in our case, hold on. Actually, in the next experiment, it's a little bit relevant. Instead of a looking time study with slightly older infants, we can find other methods that hopefully converge with looking time methods. So this is a case where each of the jars has 4 green ones, which is the one you really want, but this is in a sea of purple gum balls, and the other one is in just a few purple gum balls. So the question is, if you have a 1/4, which machine would you pick, right? To get a more the desirable green gumball. So this is a case where we actually ask the child to crawl to one of two locations, right? So I think you're right that looking time studies can be somewhat ambiguous, but I didn't get to all the control studies we've done to show it's not some low-level factor, like in the probability case. You might think, given the end result, maybe it's just, there's a lot of red in the box and there's not a lot of red in the small one. Maybe just some sort of perceptual mismatch or something, right? So we did studies to rule those sort of things out, which is that if the balls that go into the small container do not come from the big box, just come from the experiment pocket, the effect goes away, right? So there are lots of controls to show that it's not a lot of these low-level things, and a lot of replications in some cases to show that there's convergence, right? That makes sense to think of it as kind of a surprise. But it's a good question.
Related to that, if I think of like a machine analog, like I'm thinking of like feeding a bunch of video data to some model and then looking at the likelihood it assigns to all the different windows of frames. Does that seem like the appropriate analog to this kind of experiment?
I think it would be a really interesting to try. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that would be I think it reminds me of the visual prediction study that Mike was talking about this morning, right? Which is whether you can get a model to actually predict what's going to happen next. That's one way to test it, right? All right. So I won't go through these. And we also did some studies where an agent is involved, where we show that if you choose 5 blue objects from a box that has very few blue ones, they think that reflects the agent's preference, right? Whereas if you pick the same 5 blue ones from a box that has lots of blue ones, they think, okay, it's probably just random and doesn't really mean anything, right? So there are various kind of reasoning, these simple reasoning tasks that we've tried, both in my lab and many other labs, to find converging evidence. Right? And my point here is that that these systems of knowledge appear to be domain specific, right? So it's only when you think about objects, things like solidity, et cetera, seem to apply. When you think about agents, you're really more can think about their mental states from quite early on, right? Think about the intentions, and then lots of examples of that sort in literature. And back to the question of, well, is it innate or early emerging? There's been ongoing debate about these kind of studies for the last, as long as we can remember, last 40, 45 years since we first started using this kind of method back in the 1980s, mid-80s, right? And people have different views, both about the innateness and also about whether the knowledge is sort of conceptual knowledge or more part of the perceptual system. I'd be happy to discuss that later. Okay. Now we want to just turn to think a little bit about large language models. And it's trained on a huge amount of text, language data, in fact, right? And it's really, really good at many tasks. I put that one in as a joke, which is that, okay, generate titles for our papers. It does really, really good job of that. Really nice, cutesy titles that we can use, but of course, it goes way, way, way beyond that, right? One question I think might be worth asking is, if we think the foundation of human cognition is something like core knowledge, whether it's innate or early emerging, I don't think that it's so critical. But if we think really that really is the foundation, then perhaps it's worth asking whether these kind of models can do the same thing that infants can do, right? And there have been some examples in literature trying to do that already. So we decided, this is the only piece of new data I'll show you having to do with the models. We decided that social cognition may be a really nice case to think about, partly because people are interested in how to use these models and how people can interact with them, right? And there's increasingly a lot of people wanting to use them to think about emotions, theory of mind, and whether we can have mental health applications and those sort of things, right? And you can imagine social cognition is probably the most important thing we want to think about. There have been a whole bunch of papers. I didn't put the references here, but there are at least a dozen, probably more, between yesterday and today, trying to get at things like explicit theory of mind, right? And this is a false belief task that's been used a lot in the developmental literature, also known as the Sally Ann task that you may know about. But we decided to look at the implicit theory of mind, that the stuff that babies know, right? We've only done one thing in the last few weeks, so bear with me. So the question we ask is simply whether, if you take something like ChatGPT-4, whether they understand goal-directed actions the way that infants do, right? And the goal-directed experiment was the one I just showed you with the bear and the ball, right? The Woodward paradigm that's been used many, many times. And graduate student in my lab, Allison, and my colleague, cognition modeler, Bill Thompson, are the collaborators on this project. And just to remind you, the study is very simple. You got a bear and a ball, and during habituation, the hand keeps reaching for the bear. It's counterbalanced. Sometimes reaches for the ball for half of the infants, right? On the test trials, you switch the two objects, and the question is simply, which one would the hand reach for, right? And the infant data are quite clear that with the hand, they look longer at they look longer at the surprising one when it's a new goal, right? If the hand still reach for the bear when it's in a different position, they're unsurprised, and the other case is a surprising one. And with lots of whole bunch of inanimate reachers that Woodward and others have tried, there's no such expectation, right? Suggesting there's some domain specificity involved in this very simple task, right? Okay, and we know ChatGPT is trained on language data. So we turn this particular infant study into text, right? So Allison did this painstaking work trying to figure out whether there are sort of good descriptive ways to convey the idea of the infant study to the model, right? And so she came up with things like habituation intro. Here are two toys, a bear and a ball. And the bear is on the left or right, and the other toy is on the left, right. So this is just the parameters we used. And we also try to convey the idea of habituation. So we did a couple of different things. One is to say, okay, the hand again moves towards the bear, right? So we did this like 1 time, 6 times, 9 times, 14 times. I will tell you why we have those numbers, right? Other times we actually collapse those because they might seem weird if you keep saying the same thing. So we just said, 6 times in a row I did this. 6 times in a row, a hand moves towards the left object or right object, etc. Right? And when we present the model with the simple manipulation, then toys now switch positions. So we describe what the configuration looks like, and then the same hand or sponge moves in to grasp or touch one of the toys. Right. We simply pose the question. There are 2 options we gave to the model. The reacher will move towards the target, A or B, right? Either the bear or the ball, right? So very, very simple. Just turn it into simple text and feed it into the model. And we try various versions of the test prompt. In the description. So there are cases where we manipulate whether it's the target direction first or second. So it always says a hand moves towards the left and grabs the white teddy bear. That's one version. Or a hand moves towards the white teddy bear on the left, right? So the target just mentioned first. And sometimes we do a little simple lesion experiment, if you like. So we just mentioned the target toy only or the direction only. And then, as I mentioned before, sometimes we repeated the habituation trials. Other times we just collapse them and say 6 times in a row. All right, so try to make it as close as possible to the infant case, right? In contrasting a hand versus a hand like a sponge, right? We'll actually describe the sponge to say it has sort of finger-like appendages and things like that. Right? All right, and here's a plot of the various versions we did with this model. And the reason we chose 1 versus 6 versus 9 versus 14 habituation trials is that we're actually kind of interested in context learning, right? So 1 habituation trial is the minimum, and you can see the model often says not enough information, which is kind of interesting. And 6 is actually the minimum number of habituation trials for infants, right? So for any given baby, it could be a minimum of 6 habituation trials, and 14 is the maximum, because we don't want to lose too many of them, so it's just set at 14. And 9 is the average for this particular study, the Woodward study. Okay. So we try these different manipulation of habituation. And the blue is reaching the model answering reaching for the old goal, like babies. Red is new goal, and green is not-infant information, right? So for the most part, the not-infant information occurs when there's just only one habituation trial, right? That actually, I think, makes perfect sense. But then when you turn to the rest of the data, just take the first panel, we are most interested in comparing the reacher type, the hand versus the sponge, right? And what you see over and over again over the three other habituation conditions is that there's no real distinction between the hand and the sponge. And furthermore, even with the hand, there's no clear indication, like in the case of infants, that they think the old goal is in fact the right answer. Yeah.
Excuse me, have you measured estimated the standard errors? So what's the significance of the differences?
Oh, yes. We have a paper, I didn't put it here, that is, there are actually lots of significant effect, except there's never an effect of reacher type, right? So there's no distinction between the hand and the sponge in any of those cases.
So that NS in front of all of them would be?
Right, but what there is a systematic pattern. I don't know if it's obvious from the, it may not be so obvious from the graph, but essentially what happens is that two things. One is, for infants, again, I think the phenomenon is very clear. It's a very simple study that's replicated many, many times. The infants distinguish between a hand, a bunch of other inanimate objects. We only try a sponge, but we thought, they will do this just, very well, but apparently not. But for this particular model we tested just in the last few weeks, they consistently failed to distinguish the reacher type between the hand and the hand-like inanimate object. And furthermore, what you see is that what the model is sensitive to is a bunch of low-level features, right? So whatever response is presented first and most frequently, that's the one it goes for. So in the version where we only mention the target in no direction, now it looks sort of like a baby, but in the hand version, right? It says it should go for that object, the bear, right? But that's not meaningful because if you only mention the direction only, then they'll say, okay, it goes to the left, right, as opposed to the right. Right. And then when the two conflict, it's essentially 50-50. Right. We were kind of surprised by this because we thought what would happen is, okay, you can probably distinguish the hand and the sponge. They're very different. They're probably used in language in very, very different ways, and the distribution will just give you that. And we're going to go on to do all these interesting variations that in the infant literature about this really particular bear is the kind of object you're looking for, and lots of other things, right? Whether you're actually reaching for it or just flopping your hand on an intentional action, those kind of things, right? So we're surprised even at step one, when we try to match the text input as closely as we can to the infant study, the model is not doing very well.
Yeah, very cool to see this result. We actually tried doing what you did and looking at, reaching as an indicator of preference or even, like path as an indicator of efficiency. What we found for us it was very hard to adapt those visual stimuli into text, right? And so we actually kind of gave up and went with much simpler text studies. The question is, how do you think adults would perform on your stimuli? Have you measured that? Do you think it's intuitive? Will that work in the same way as visual stimuli work?
Yeah. Very good question. We haven't done that yet. Like I said, this ongoing study has been ongoing for like a few weeks, really. Yeah. So what we did is, the three of us who looked at the text version very closely, we think we still have the same intuition that the hand is different from a sponge. I mean, that's a really basic distinction, if you like, right? However you think hands might behave, how you interpret those actions, but it's probably very different from what you expect from a sponge and those sort of entities, right? So I think that's one thing to think about. There's many, many more things we can try for sure, right? One thing we did try just a little bit is you can say, infant comes into the lab. The first thing they see, a bunch of other, like experimenters, RAs, and their parents. They interact with a bunch of humans and their toys in the lab for them to play with at the beginning for about 10 minutes. They're probably doing a lot of reaching and stuff. Maybe they're primed to think about intentional actions, right? So we try to think whether there are at least sort of a priming we can do in the case of the model by providing a little bit of context. So we tried a couple of things, just on the top of our heads. Pretend you're watching a play. On the stage, there are two objects, and the hand reaches for one, and the rest is the same. Or we tried a version where you're watching somebody reaching into a refrigerator to get dessert, and there are two options, X or Y, and it keeps reaching for X over and over again on day 1, day 2, day 3, et cetera, and then what happens on day x plus 1, right? And then we thought, okay, maybe if you keep reaching the same dessert, maybe you should switch. So we did a version where not just future-oriented, but also past prediction kind of thing, right? So we tried a few things like that. If anything, the context actually hurt. The model was even more random and no distinction between the research type. Again, we were quite surprised, but this is where we're at, and would be really interested in people's ideas on how to do this. One thing, of course, is to do some sort of multimodal sort of thing that might be easier, but I still think it's worth thinking about the text version.
I have a similar question to the previous one, but going a little bit further, like what made you want to do this comparison to begin with? And like if they had been very similar, like what would you have concluded about ChatGPT?
Yeah. Great questions. Okay, I have a final slide on open questions that's related to this. So, like I said, we were surprised, but I think there's still many things we can try, and I think it's a worthy enterprise. But let me raise a couple of questions, but then we'll come back to this. I think it's a bigger question we can discuss, right? Another thing, we haven't done any studies. We're interested in pursuing this, but you might think, okay, is number a domain for ChatGPT-4, right? So there's a paper, a really nice one, by McGrath and Tom Griffith and their colleagues on archive somewhere. And what they want to argue is that given how given that these models trying to predict the next word and how they're trained and the amount of data they get, you would think some tasks will be harder than others. In particular, it should be sensitive to things like input probability, output probability, and a few other things, right? And they tried a whole bunch of things, ChatGPT 3.5 and 4, I believe, and included some number tasks that I think are particularly interesting. So there's a linear function they tried, apply this and then give them some, what x equals 328 and spit out output, or multiplication and counting and a few other things, right? The only thing I will show is that if the model is given a familiar function, so that's basically converting Celsius to Fahrenheit, right? That's the equation for that. The model does sort of a pretty okay job, but if you just tweak it a little bit to something that's not very likely to be happening a lot in the input, all of a sudden the model seems to fall apart. Right? So they did this much more systematically to show over and over again that the rare things are the ones that the models are really bad at, right? And the more common things are the ones the models are really bad at. Okay. But how is this relevant? So, well, you might think math is just math, right? So, but apparently for these models is not. And perhaps one idea, one hypothesis is that one number isn't a domain in the relevant sense for these models, right? Because basically it's treated as text, right? Just like all the other words that are in there, right? Perhaps that's one reason. This is not totally directly relevant. So I want to cite one of the papers from Brendan's lab from last 2 years ago, right? Where they looked at the single child's data and trying to do this word-object mappings with these deep learning networks, and done a really good job of it, right? And what I want to push them on is, well, word learning is also a domain that is different from many others. One thing that's been debated a lot in the literature is eventually, words are referential, right? There are symbols that refer to both mental representations and things in the world, right? And the debate is about maybe infants start with these more associative learning type of things. They need many examples to learn their own name. They need many examples, hundreds of examples to learn, to kind of know the meanings of common objects like cup, ball, and dog, right? This has been shown in 6-month-olds, where they get a huge amount of input, slow mapping, if you like, right? But things change over the course of development. But in particular, by 12 to 18 months, roughly speaking, there's evidence that they start to think words may be referential, that you can talk about things that are absent, right? So it's no visual input. You can still, they can still think about that. Their demonstrations show that they can update the representations just based on language alone, right? So if you start with a sponge that's dry, and then the sponge goes away from the scene, and then you talk about the sponge falling into a full of water and now it's wet, et cetera, then the toddlers can update their representation and then go out in the world and find the wet sponge being the same one that we talked about before, right? And we put out this hypothesis fairly recently. We're thinking that maybe the social aspect is actually really important, that there's a lot of back and forth, socially conditioned interactions between the parent and the child. That could potentially be a mechanism for the child to understand the communicative intent of the person based on some prior knowledge about theory of mind, implicit theory of mind, right? That could be a mechanism to get them thinking that these words actually work such that they are in fact referential. They refer to both things in the world and things in your hands, right? So I want to kind of push them a little bit to see if those kind of model can get to that point and whether the same mechanisms can get you there, or maybe you require different kind of mechanisms. All right, I'm almost out of time. So one question you might want to ask is whether knowledge is domain-specific as in human infants and structured. But I want to agree with the previous two speakers from today, which is I think there are so many interesting open research questions and lots of opportunities for both cognitive science and the AI community, right? And that's really related to some of the questions that have been asked already. One is thinking about how knowledge is structured in these large language models and other sort of models, deep learning models, right? And what are the pros and cons, right? I think for the most part, people have been poking these models and say, oh, okay, it fails at X, Y, and Z, and really counterintuitive, really easy things it can fail. It does like weird things every now and then, right? But maybe there are also some pros one can think about, right? And I think maybe thinking about core knowledge, maybe one way to test some of those ideas, how the knowledge is structured, and that could give us some insights, right? Similarly, it's tricky to do, but I still think it's worth thinking about, which is given these large models are trained on all this text information, which is all language, they're sentences, in fact, right? One could potentially maybe ask the question, what can be learned from language alone, right? And perhaps LLMs could be a guide for us. You might think they fail at Woodward's go-directed action kind of step because that kind of knowledge is really implicit and it takes some other format, right? The details need to be worked out. It's not as simple, but I think it's worth thinking about, right? And lastly, going back to what Mike was talking about this morning, can we get a version like a baby view for core knowledge, right? I was really interested in the physical reasoning model that he presented this morning for exactly that reason. That is, now we have these different kind of architectures we can play with, and can we get better data from infants and use these models as a test bed for thinking, okay, is that a plausible mechanism or algorithm for learning the kind of physical knowledge we have? Because the infant literatures are quite rich. And there are cases of physical reasoning where people like Renee Barrajon and others actually track to see how, at what month infants know X or Y or Z, right? And there's a very nice developmental trajectory that can be tested against the model, right? And of course, there are other type of models you can try as well, not just transformer architecture. It could be convolutional networks and lots of other things. Right. So I think there are lots of interesting possibilities, a lot of opportunities for both the cognitive science community and the AI community. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I have a question related to what was asked before, and I think that, well, it's for the sponge hand again.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in some ways the large language models are a lot smarter than the babies, and in the sense that as an adult as well, if I would see a sponge moving, I would assume a person moving the sponge, so that if you maybe would replace the sponge with a mechanical hand, where you could assume some automation but no human behind steering or something.
Yeah. That's a great question. It so happens in a different context, my own lab, we did one study where we're interested in the agent versus non-agent distinction. And we had a hand reaching into a bucket and pulling out a bunch of ping pong balls. And the outcome is something like, red, red, green, red, red, green, red, red, green. So it has a very clear pattern, right? And the babies think, okay, it has to be a hand and not a claw that produced that outcome, right? But then we actually did a version where we, when the babies come into the lab, we show them a claw that's held by a hand. The experimenter, obviously with the arm and a hand, and that actually changes their expectation. They start to think of it as hand, right? So the default seems to be if I see a inanimate object moving a particular way, it's different from how a hand, which is part of agent, might behave, right? But I think the babies we test were like 10 months or something. So they can, augment that knowledge given the context we put them in the lab where somebody's holding the claw, right? They can say your intention can be translated into that, right? But I think it's a great question. And one question I don't know, which is whether people, I think obviously you can just ask the ChatGPT to explain their responses, something like that. But you have to say probably, give me a 5-sentence explanation, not like a 500-page explanation or something, right? That could be one way to get at those things. And I think that could be potentially a really, really interesting tool, especially in light of these findings. I haven't looked into the details. Like, if you ask it to go through the reasoning process step by step, it seems to do better. For a lot of in development, I think that would be an interesting phenomenon to chase down. And perhaps for each step, you can say, why did you do that? Whether that could give you additional insight. But I really like that suggestion. I think there's a lot more you can do, even just with this very simple phenomenon.
One high-level clarification. Mm-hmm. Like you characterize this core knowledge in infants as structured and domain-specific. But I didn't fully follow in what sense it's domain-specific. Like,
So a number is an interesting case. But we can start with something more concrete, namely objects versus agents, right? So the idea in the infant literature is that there are mechanisms in the infant's brain, and they're picking out certain type of entities, like inanimate objects, like the chairs in this room, and lots of other things you can think about that don't move on their own, like blocks in the baby's environment. Actually, toys are good examples. And once you identify that domain, those are the kind of entities that fall under the domain. There's a set of principles, like solidity, continuity, and contact, that you can use to reason about them, right? And furthermore, you can get to things like support. So that's one thing. Remember in Mike's talk, there's this stack of, the tower that's built a bunch of blocks, right? So the idea is that if you pull one of them out, the whole thing should fall apart, and not like the rest of the tower should go with you or something, right? So many more complex physical phenomena you can think about. And there's some literature in infancy to show that they can understand support, but initially they don't quite understand very well. So if there's a platform and there's an object here, if I push it, even when it's just touching a little bit on the platform, the baby thinks it shouldn't fall. But if it's all the way down, it says it should fall, right? So they can then learn, or maybe it has to be like half and half or something, right? That for the support for the top object to stay on top of the bottom object, right? But now if you have asymmetrical object, that's more complicated, right? Because you can have, like, say, a triangle or something, and you push it off a platform. Then even when there's more than half that's left, the bottom of the platform, it can still hold, right? Because obviously physics works such as not just about that one variable. So those kind of the more complex amount that comes in that only apply to these physical objects, right? So once you identify a set of entities and you have the basic principles, that allows you to kind of run pretty fast in thinking about, okay, these other things will follow. I can figure out the relevant variables of thinking about occlusion events or covering events or support events, etc. Right? But for agents, that's not their concern. They're concerned about agents, even though we think of physical objects as well, right? Eventually, obviously, that changes. But for babies, what they care about is, what do you want? What do you like? What's your goal? What are your intentions? Intention is a good one. So there are cases to show take a 15-month-old, if the adult demonstrates they're trying to get one part of a toy off of the other, but they keep failing. So you try it over and over again, but you keep failing. You hand object over to the baby, they pull it apart, right? As if to say, you never show me the end result of your action, but I read your intention, which is you try to pull this part of the toy off of that, right? But those kind of reasoning only applies to agents, especially early on as humans, right? So that's the sense of domain specificity that people would talk about.
Yes, so you're making a very strict separation between objects and agents, right? So I've been talking a lot to people who build AI robots recently, and even if you only have like a vacuum that's in your apartment going about, probably the baby will think it has a goal and it's an agent, right? So in the future, will this boundary
the distinction isn't so clear-cut. I think you're right. And in fact, we start to think about, everybody probably experienced that, when your computer doesn't do something, you get really frustrated and you start, blame it for doing something, right? Even though we know, especially people here, it's just following some algorithms and maybe there's a glitch somewhere, but really, right? So we do have this propensity, I think, to try to achieve intentionality in things. And in a lot of infant studies, actually, you don't really need full-fledged people in your studies. They're often like geometric figures with eyes. So you need certain kind of morphological features, like self-generated motion, maybe having eyes and things like that. But they don't have to be fully-fledged humans. So that domain is actually fairly abstract in very interesting ways for the reasons you just mentioned. But you're right, as development happens, it starts to change. But I think the domain specific still holds in the sense that if the vacuum cleaner is doing stuff automatically in particular ways, you're probably more likely to attribute some sort of intentionality to it. But if it always just goes, straight line and straight line, straight line, you might think, okay, that's not quite how volitional movement will work, right? So we actually very sensitive to those subtle distinctions, distinguishing agents with intentions and mental states versus things that don't.
Maybe one more question?
Oh, thanks. Brenda.
Thanks for the great talk. I'm curious about your last point about the difference between associative learning and words as mapping to reference. What do you think would be the experiment that would convince you that a model could have reference as opposed to?
Brenda was just talking about this morning, and we haven't come up with the key study, but I think it would be great to talk more about this, right? So absent reference is one thing that's been done, and there's actually maybe about a couple dozen studies to show the infant's ability to deal with absent reference actually develops over the course of, they can do more and more, right? At the beginning, they have to be primed, they have to be a certain kind of situation, but then eventually, you just say something, they can say, okay, the sponge is a sponge, I can represent it, even though I've never seen it, and then they can use other words to actually figure out what you mean, and things of that sort, right? So I think that's the kind of phenomenon we have in mind. And you mentioned the study by Preisler, where if you teach a child with pictures that, that's a blicket, that's a blicket, this is a blicket, and you show them a real blicket and the picture, they actually pick the real blicket, right? I have a feeling the model probably won't do that. So that would be another kind of test that we can think about. Right?
We could try that with ChatGPT, right?
Yeah.
Or the Baldwin, looking in a box.
That's right.
You can have an image where you can actually see the object and there's a naming event, and then reveal it later and see what the system thinks the name is.
So the study that I refer to is that there are two buckets, and there are novel objects that babies don't know names for, and the baby is focusing on one of them, right? And then the experimenter looks inside the other bucket and says, "Oh, I see a blicket. I see a blicket." Right. So by about 18 months of age, the child actually looks up at the experimenter to see what she's looking at, and then and infer that what she's looking at is actually the blicket, not the one that they are. Because if I think I'm looking at an object, I hear a word, I'm just going to automatically associate it with what I'm looking at. Young babies might do something like that, actually. They're not very good until about 18 months of age. But by 18 months, it switches. They look up to see what you're trying to refer to, right? And they pick the other object that's in the experimenter's bucket, not their own, right? So I think there's a set of things we can try. I think it would be really interesting to think about.